Hi guys. I am jumping over to Acts today. Happened upon this passage and kind of spoke to me. So I am here in Acts chapter 18. And I also had been spending some time yesterday just thinking and considering Paul the Apostle, that is, and just why can't I be more like Paul, right? Do you ever have those thoughts like, why can't I be more like Jesus? Like, this is what he did, and here I am not doing that, right? So, Paul, though, he was just so surrendered to Christ, and it was almost as though he welcomed persecution. I'm sure he didn't like it. None of us like it. None of us like hardship and trials and abuse and persecution. But, Paul was just, he was given such a measure of grace when he was converted that no matter what may come, Paul was always sold out to, be submitted to it no matter what, as long as it, meant glory for God. And so it's such an amazing example of what we are capable of when we are truly surrendered to Jesus Christ. And so we never see Paul complaining. We don't see him victimizing himself, ever. And look what he went through, right? Beaten, stoned, imprisoned, shipwrecked, mocked. The list goes on. And, he was always on the forefront when it came to preaching and teaching, excuse me, even in the most difficult places and to the most difficult people. He knew what he signed up for, right? And he was willing. And he followed Jesus most fully, right? And so I want to be more like him and less like me, and of course more like Jesus ultimately. But today I just happened to open up to Paul in Corinth. I found him in Corinth, and the time that he spent there in Acts chapter 18, we find Paul getting a job, making tents with some Christian friends. We see him faithfully attending the synagogue in an effort to persuade the Jews of the gospel message, right? He's faithfully going every week. He's going in. And of course, we see that it ends up with him being opposed and reviled because of that. And I'm like, oh, I feel you, Paul. Like, same, right? I get it. I've been there. So then, get this though. This is so awesome. And this is something I kind of stumbled upon a couple years ago. And I just think this is so boss. This is so awesome. Like, the next thing Paul does after he's opposed and he kind of shakes the dust and he's like, all right, I'm not coming back to the synagogue because you guys won't hear me and I'm telling you the truth and all you want to do is beat me up for it. So get this. The next thing Paul does after that happens is he goes next door to the synagogue and he starts like a home church there, right? He starts a home church for the Gentiles, right? And we see people being saved next door to the synagogue, people that the Jews, have deemed unclean and who will never have salvation, right? How boss is that? That is so awesome. You have to love this guy, right? You have to love Paul. And so some believed, some Jews believed, some Gentiles believed because of Paul's efforts. And those guys were baptized. And even the ruler of the synagogue, it says, I think his name was Crispus, and he ended up believing, him and his whole family. So awesome stuff is happening. Paul's being faithful, right? He gets kicked out basically, but he just goes next door and keeps right on preaching. And so, we want to be like that, right? He doesn't get discouraged. But one night we see Paul having a vision. And you have to understand, like, Paul did stay in Corinth for like a year during this little stint here. So this wasn't like a week's time. So Paul has a vision, and it's from the Lord, and the Lord tells him to not be afraid, right? Wonder why the Lord would come specifically to him and say that, right? Could Paul have been worried about what would happen if he continued preaching? Could it have been? I see no reason why Jesus would have come and given him this particular kind of encouragement at this particular time if Paul wasn't in need of it, right? Our God is not arbitrary in the things that he says and the things that he does for us. And so the great and mighty Paul must have had some sort of inkling of fear or discouragement, right? He must have. Jesus knows what we need, and he doesn't speak arbitrarily. And so he tells Paul in a vision not to be afraid. And then he gives him some more instructions. Jesus tells Paul to go on speaking. He says, do not be silent. He reassures Paul that he is and always will be with him, right? That's great encouragement. He comforts Paul by ensuring that he's not going to be attacked by anyone, and he assures him that many in the city already belong to Christ. Like, you've got a team. There's people on your side. You might not even know them yet, but they're here. So don't worry. And so what is Jesus saying? He's saying, Paul, you have support, right? Don't worry. Don't fear. You're going to be beaten. You aren't going to be beaten up here, right? Not this time. Not this time. And so why does Jesus say this stuff? Paul has already been through many trials, toils, and snares, like the song says, right? Paul has been mocked. He's been beaten repeatedly. He's been imprisoned. He's been rejected on every level. He's been rebuked. He's been cast out. He's been busted up really bad, right? In many places where he has already been. I mean, consider that for a minute. Consider it. You're innocent. All you're trying to do is preach the gospel. The only motive you have is love and salvation for your brothers. You're going around from town to town trying to save some of them, right? With the truth, with the gospel. And that's your heart, right? You're doing this because you love Jesus and you love them. You love your brothers, right? But everywhere you go and everything you try to do, you get beat up. You get beat up, you get hurt, you get imprisoned, you get stoned, mocked, hated, you name it. So consider where Paul is when he is in Corinth now. Now, he's not being beat up right now, but Paul knows what's expected of him, and he accepts it. He's willing, like so few today are. He's been willing since the day those scales fell from his eyes. And to be very honest, I often feel ashamed of how unwilling I am to suffer nobly for Christ, right? I feel it. I feel my flesh crying out, like, just clinging to my own, selfishness, I guess it is, and right to myself and right to not suffer, right? But we don't have that right when we follow Christ. But anyway, he's always been willing. Paul has been willing since the day the scales fell from his eyes, and he accepted the call of Christ with no holds barred, and he meant it, right? He lived it. And sometimes, even if we're willing to live it, and even if we accept it, and even if we boldly preach and accept suffering for doing so, we still complain about it. That's me. That's where I'm at. We still want to complain, right? But Paul didn't do that. But, even Paul must have had some fear. He must have had some weariness setting in on his emotional state. He must have been starting to wonder why he could never just preach and love people and have a moment or two of prosperity, of joy, and of fellowship without yet another severe trauma being dropped on his head. He must have, or Jesus would not have appeared to him this way and for the sole reason of saying these words to him. There has to have been a reason that Jesus said these things. And so this is something that I really haven't considered in the past, and maybe I didn't see it. I think this is not I haven't written through Acts yet, so I think, although I've read it a lot, I don't think I've ever quite seen this passage in this light, because it doesn't tell us how Paul was feeling. It doesn't do that. It doesn't say that he was afraid. It doesn't say that he was discouraged or worn down or anything of the sort. It does, however, tell us what Jesus chose to say to him. And since we know that Jesus does not waste futile words, and he especially does not do so in supernatural visions, we can safely deduce that there had to have been a reason for him to say these particular words to Paul at this time. Paul must have had fear, at least a little bit, and some discouragement during his stay in Corinth. Jesus encourages him, saying, "Do not fear, do not be silent, keep on speaking. I'm with you." He encourages Paul for the sake of his confidence. And so why? Because Paul's about to stand before the tribunal for his preaching. Jesus knows this. Paul probably doesn't know this. Paul has to be confident and not fearful. He isn't going to get punished this time. Jesus assures him of that. And so Jesus counts on Paul's faith in him and in his words to carry him through this test, and he encourages that faith by giving him a vision of great support, right? And so Paul is brought before the government leaders. Acts 18:12 tells us that the Jews made a united attack upon Paul. Satan loves to make united attacks upon us, doesn't he? Now, this is what I saw when I first opened the word this morning. The Jews made a united attack. And all I could think of was Satan and how he does this. He doesn't just bring evil, destruction, and hardship from one source in our life. He brings his attacks from all angles in an effort to destroy us completely. He knows that the more areas we experience pain and trauma in, the less likely we are to have confidence, assurance, and faith in our daily life and in our daily spiritual life as well. And so we need to really beware the united attacks of Satan. He loves to get people together and attack us jointly from all angles in all areas of life. Okay? And so we see the Jews coming together to falsely accuse Paul of law breaking. And of course it's lies, but because they all joined together in this deceitful darkening of this man, it becomes much more credible to those who don't know better, right? Satan likes to play dirty, so he's going to use these guys who have religious position and authority that the people, quote unquote, trust because they're in positions of leadership and trust. He's going to use them coming together against the true man of God, who is Paul, and darkening him in a joint sort of way so that the gospel is not successful, so that Paul gives up, so that Paul is abused, so that he can shut Paul up, right? This is what the Jews want. This is what Satan wants ultimately. And so Satan likes to do this. He uses a united front to get to us, and he attacks us in many areas all at once, right? He brings his forces together to bring us down because that's what it's going to take, right? We have Jesus Christ on our side, and Satan knows that Christ is no match, and he lives within us. And so he pulls out all the stops, right? When he attacks us, which is all the time, but sometimes more than others. But anyway, fortunately, Jesus is king over all, right? The whole game. Instead of being found guilty of these false charges as the Jews are bringing against Paul doesn't even have to testify. The proconsul drives everyone out of his presence, and he has the new ruler of the synagogue beaten instead. Now, this wasn't the ruler that accepted Christ that we saw just like a few verses before, accepting Christ with his whole family. Apparently, over the course of the time that Paul stayed in Corinth, that ruler was either dismissed for his faith in Jesus, or for whatever reason, there's a new synagogue ruler. Okay, so the government guy beats the synagogue ruler instead of beating Paul. Now this is like a one and done almost. Like this never happens, right? Paul always gets beaten, but not this time. And Jesus told him he wasn't going to. And so the government guy, he pays no attention to any of these false charges made upon Paul by this unified attack of the Jews. He could care less about religion anyway. He doesn't care. It doesn't concern him. The only thing the proconsul cares about is civil justice. He's irritated that these men even came to him. And apparently, the synagogue ruler who had accepted Christ was no longer the synagogue ruler. So I can't imagine why, right? I think it was probably because of his faith in Jesus. But the new guy gets beat for the treachery against God's servant, Paul. And I think it's something to really consider because, these false religious men that we just see, daily in scandals and abuse and unjust and abuse of authority, we see this all the time in our culture. And it's treachery against God himself, but also against his children. And there will come a day where there will be a reckoning for this abuse of power. There really will. And it's scary to think about, and I pray they repent, those that are doing those kinds of things. But in any case, there will be a reckoning. There will be, and we can count on that. So we see it happening here. And this is a story that I can get behind, right? Because how many times do we see Paul get beat up? We see Stephen getting stoned. We see Jesus getting crucified. We see all the followers and all the disciples in so many places, and every single page we turn, what do we see? We see the good guys going down innocently in just an effort to do what's right. They're trying to preach the gospel. They're trying to do what's right. And what happens to them? They just, all hell breaks loose against them. And, the demons are in rogue when we're doing what God wants, right? But here in this, I guess, obscure passage of Acts 18, we find something else. Here we find Jesus encouraging Paul to keep preaching, to have great confidence, because he has great support, right? And we find the bad guys getting their due and Paul going free. How great is that, right? And so, praise God for the reprieves that Satan's, attacks, from Satan's attacks, right? Because they're few and far between sometimes. But God's grace does give us rest when he sees our weariness. And, I just can't help but think that Paul must have had some weariness about him by this point. And I can't help but think that isn't why, that is why Jesus came in this vision, to encourage him and to just give him a reprieve from the suffering and the beating and the attacks for just a moment, just to encourage him. Jesus gives us strong support. He gives us encouragement when we're discouraged, and he knows when we've had our all, right? He knows when we're at the end of our rope, and so he knows when to bolster our confidence, or when we need him most, or when we fear even. And so I just think it's a great little passage, and I would encourage you to read it and just be encouraged as well, because it's an amazing, gracious God we serve, despite the many things he does tell us to walk through and to endure for his sake. And it's a privilege. We have to remember that it is a privilege, because so many times I fail to thank God for using me and trusting me enough to go through persecution and suffering for his name's sake. It's a privilege, and we got to remember that. I have to remember that. And so I hope you remember it too, and I hope that's helpful, and I hope that's encouraging for you today. And I will see you later. Thanks for listening.